Jesus had been ministering mainly in Galilee, and Luke is presenting his Galilean ministry to us. He'd made his base in Capernaum, having been rejected from his hometown of Nazareth. But his focus was to visit every place, to go and heal and to teach. And wherever he went, there were a large crowd following. In Luke chapter 6, he had called his disciples to himself and chosen 12 who would become the apostles. But as well as the apostles and the other disciples, there was also a large crowd that waited for him at the bottom of the mountain. And when he came down with his disciples, he taught the crowd what was expected of a disciple, how his disciples were to live, how it contrasted with the normal way of living. The normal way is a self-centered, immediate gratification view, whereas Jesus was saying that now you will have suffering, but there will be the kingdom of heaven for you in the future. Why do you call me Lord and not do the things that I say? If you take heed to my words, your life will withstand the storms that will beat against it. And having taught the crowds out in the wilderness with his sayings, that is, the expressions that he was training his disciples to learn, and those sayings are now passed to us. He didn't just say these things once. He had sayings, he had recitations that he taught the people. And as he had taught the people these things, then he'd come back into Capernaum, where a centurion had pleaded through the elders that Jesus heal his servant. Jesus had acceded to the centurion's request, because the centurion, although a Roman, showed great faith. Although he had all the authority of Rome behind him, he could not heal his servant. And so he acknowledged Jesus as the one who could, just by a word, heal his servant, which Jesus did. The following day, we read from Luke chapter 7, verse 11. Now it happened the day after that he went into a city called Nain, and many of his disciples went with him, and a large crowd. And when he came near the gate of the city, behold, a dead man was being carried out, the only son of his mother, and she was a widow. And a large crowd from the city was with her. When the Lord saw her, he had compassion on her, and said to her, Do not weep. Then he came and touched the open coffin, and those who carried him stood still, and said, Young man, I say to you, arise. And so he who was dead sat up and began to speak. And Jesus presented him to his mother. Then fear came upon all, and they glorified God, saying, A great prophet has risen up among us, and God has visited his people. And the report about him went throughout all Judea and all the surrounding region. My name's Arthur, and I thank you for joining me as we share these thoughts, these words together. Well, I commented when we read the story of the centurion that the crowd had nothing to see. Jesus was heading to the centurion's house. He had a conversation with some friends who met him, and he turned away again. But when those friends got back to the centurion, the servant was well. But this time there was something to see. When they came to Nain, Jesus was accompanied by many of his disciples. These were people who'd committed themselves to learning his sayings, and no doubt that's what they did as they walked along the road. They learned the things that Jesus was teaching them, reciting them together. But there was also another crowd, people who had not committed themselves to being disciples, but were interested and intrigued by Jesus. They had not yet made that decision to follow him. And so they came to this city, a walled city with a gate. But as they approach the gate, they find that there is another large crowd coming out. So the roadway gets very congested as these two crowds converge. At the front of this other crowd are some men carrying an open basket with a dead man in it. They're taking him out to the cemetery to bury him. And behind the basket is a woman crying profusely. We learn that she is a widow, and this was her only son. The fact that there was a large crowd reflects the fact that this widow was highly regarded in the city. She was known, and many people felt sorry for her, that now her security for the future was gone. Her son had died, he was no longer able to look after her. She was a widow, she had no husband, she had no other son, and what would she do as she grew old? Well, they sought to comfort her and console her as this large company from the city came with her. Jesus sees her crying. He understands the situation that she is now in, that her future looks very bleak. And so he says to her, "Do not weep." And then he goes over to the coffin, and those carrying it stop. And Jesus says, "Young man, I say to you, arise." Whenever Jesus raised the dead in the gospel accounts, he is always particular to identify the individual that he is raising. In a future day, he will issue the decree, "Come up here, and the dead in Christ shall rise first, and we who are alive and remain shall be caught up in clouds to meet the Lord in the air." That's a future day when many people will be raised at one time. But now he is resuscitating rather than resurrecting individuals, and he names the individual concerned. "Young man, I say to you, arise." This time there are many witnesses. These people see this young man sit up at the command of Jesus and to begin to speak. And Jesus takes him out of the basket and presents him to his mother. In this way, Jesus is seen and recognized as a great prophet. The people understood that it was only great prophets who were able to perform miracles. When we look at the Old Testament story, we find miracles particularly associated with Moses and with Elijah. Most of the prophets did not perform great miracles. They simply spoke in the name of the Lord. But Moses and Elijah performed great miracles, and Jesus also performed great miracles. So the people said, "A great prophet has risen among us." And this meant that God had visited his people. The time that Moses came was a time of great deliverance of the children of Israel from Egypt. God delivered them by a mighty hand. And at this time, the children of Israel were looking for a great deliverance from Roman domination. Would God again use Jesus to deliver them from the Romans? In any case, Jesus was a great prophet. They saw a man who was walking among them. He was a teacher. He was a person who had intriguing things to say. But he was also a man of power to raise the dead. And so this great crowd had much to talk about. They told everybody about Jesus. The news went through all Judea and all the surrounding region. And so in these ways, Jesus has shown himself to be a great prophet. The crowds at large don't recognize him as the Son of God or as the Messiah, because the Messiah will come with an army to throw out the Romans. But everybody's talking about Jesus, and we must talk about him too. Do you have a testimony of what Jesus has done in your life?